Tom Hanks once whispered through tears that there are some stories even a lifetime of fame cannot protect you from. And in that trembling moment, it felt like the truth was finally breaking free. The camera would later catch him sitting alone in a dim studio, the lights soft on his aging face, the lines of joy and sorrow etched equally deep, and what he was about to say would leave even his closest friends stunned. At 78, with his voice slightly weaker and his hands not quite as steady as they once were, Tom was no longer the smiling hero everyone thought they knew. He was a man haunted by memories that refused to stay buried, and at the center of them stood Rob Reiner, a name that once meant laughter, loyalty, and creative magic, but now carried a weight that made Tom's chest tighten whenever he spoke it. They had met decades earlier, two young men in a Hollywood that still felt small enough to conquer. Rob, with his booming laugh and fearless vision, and Tom, still hungry and unsure, clung to each other as if they were brothers. They shared scripts over late-night coffee, argued passionately over scenes, and dreamed of movies that would outlive them. People like Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal would drift in and out of their lives, adding to the feeling that they were part of something rare and beautiful. For a while it was. But even the brightest friendships can hide shadows, and Tom would later say that those early days, so full of promise, were also quietly planting the seeds of heartbreak. As fame wrapped around them, the pressure grew unbearable. Studios wanted more, audiences demanded perfection, and somewhere between the red carpets and the box office numbers, something fragile began to crack. Tom remembered a night after a premiere, the applause still ringing in his ears, when Rob pulled him aside and spoke with a seriousness he had never seen before. There were fears, regrets, and worries about health that Rob brushed off as nothing, but Tom felt a chill run through him that he couldn't explain. It was as if his friend was trying to tell him something without actually saying it, and that unsaid truth would later haunt him more than any spoken word ever could. Years passed, and life moved forward with the relentless force it always does. Tom built a family, held his children close, and tried to be the steady, loving father he never had. Rob continued to create, to laugh, to be the larger-than-life presence everyone adored. Yet behind the scenes, there were hospital visits that never made the tabloids, phone calls that ended too quickly, and long silences that felt heavier than any argument. Tom's wife would sometimes ask him what was wrong, and he would just shake his head, unable to explain the knot in his chest whenever Rob's name came up. He didn't want to worry his family, not when they had already weathered enough storms of their own. The turning point came quietly, as most tragedies do. Tom received a call late one evening, Rob's voice barely recognizable, thin and strained, telling him he needed to talk. Not about a movie, not about a script, but about something far more final. They spoke for hours, revisiting old memories, laughing through tears, and skirting around a truth neither of them wanted to face. At the end of the call, Rob said something that would echo in Tom's mind for the rest of his life. Words that sounded like both an apology and a goodbye. Tom tried to brush it off, but deep down he knew something was slipping away, something he might never get back. Now, sitting in that quiet studio, Tom felt all of it flooding back. The secrets they kept, the pain they never shared, and the guilt that had followed him like a shadow. He spoke of missed chances and words left unsaid, of how even legends, like Steven Spielberg and Nora Ephron, had noticed the distance growing between him and Rob, though no one ever dared to ask why. His voice cracked as he admitted that fame had given him everything except the courage to confront the one friendship that mattered most. And as he wiped away a tear, it became clear that this was not just a story about Hollywood, but about two men who loved each other like family and still somehow managed to lose their way. The room felt heavy with emotion as Tom paused, staring into the darkness beyond the camera, as if he were looking straight at Rob across the years. He knew that what he was about to reveal would change how people saw their friendship forever, but he also knew he could no longer carry it alone. The truth, whatever it was, had waited long enough, and it was finally demanding to be heard in a voice that was breaking under the weight of its own honesty. The silence after Tom's last breath into the microphone felt endless. And then he began again, softer, almost as if he were afraid Rob might hear him from wherever he was now. He spoke about the first time he realized something was wrong, not in the tabloid sense of scandal, but in the quiet, devastating way that only close friends ever notice. Rob had started forgetting things, small at first, a name here, a meeting there, but then entire conversations would vanish from his memory like smoke. Tom tried to joke about it, tried to protect him the way friends do, but inside he was terrified. He remembered watching Rob struggle to remember a line he had written himself, and the look in his eyes was not confusion, but fear, the kind that reaches into your soul and squeezes. Doctors were involved, but always behind closed doors. Rob didn't want the world to know, not the fans who saw him as endlessly sharp and witty, not the colleagues like Martin Scorsese or Ron Howard who still treated him as a creative force of nature. And Tom, loyal to a fault, kept the secret even when it was eating him alive. P.W. One night, Tom was on set, exhausted, when he missed 3 calls from Rob. By the time he got a break and called back, it was too late. A nurse answered, her tone gentle but distant, and told him Rob had been asking for him. He had been agitated, confused, and then suddenly very calm. Tom could hear the machines in the background, the sterile hum of a hospital room that felt a million miles away from Hollywood. He told the nurse to put Rob on the phone, begged her, but she said he was sleeping now, and maybe that was for the best. Tom hung up and sat alone in his trailer, staring at his reflection in the mirror, feeling like he had just failed the one person who needed him most. The next morning, the news came. Rob was still alive, but something had shifted, something irreversible. When Tom finally went to see him, the man in the bed looked smaller, fragile in a way he had never been before. Rob smiled when he saw him, but there was a sadness in that smile that broke Tom's heart. He held his hand and told him he was there, that he wasn't going anywhere, and Rob nodded as if he understood, even if part of him no longer did. Later, when Tom stepped out into the hallway, he collapsed against the wall, sobbing quietly so no one would hear. A famous actor, adored by millions, reduced to a grieving friend who felt utterly powerless, in the studio years later. Tom's eyes glistened as he shared this, his voice barely above a whisper. He admitted that he had blamed himself for not picking up that night, for not saying the right things when there was still time. He talked about how his children had watched him go through it, how they had seen their strong father crumble, and how that pain had become part of their family story too. Even now, he said, there were days when he woke up expecting a message from Rob, a joke, a memory, anything, and the emptiness that followed was almost unbearable. The truth he was circling was heavy and raw, and as he took a shaky breath, it was clear he was getting closer to it, closer to the part of the story he had never told anyone. The lights in the studio felt harsher now, as if they were urging him to go on, to finally say the words he had been holding back for so long, and the air itself seemed to wait with him, aching for what was about to be revealed. Tom leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, as though the weight of the next words might pull him down if he didn't brace himself. He confessed that what made Rob's illness so devastating wasn't just the slow erosion of memory, but the secret Rob had shared with him long before anyone else knew. In a quiet restaurant in Los Angeles, tucked away from curious eyes, Rob had told him he was afraid not of dying, but of being forgotten while still alive. He said there were days when he could already feel parts of himself slipping away, like pages being torn from a book, and he had begged Tom to remember him if no one else could. Tom had promised, not realizing then how heavy that promise would become. As the disease tightened its grip, Rob began to push people away. Old friends stopped getting calls back, meetings were canceled, and even family members were sometimes kept at a distance. It wasn't because he didn't love them, Tom explained, but because he didn't want them to see him like that, confused and vulnerable. He wanted to be remembered as the strong, brilliant man who had made the world laugh. Tom became one of the few he still trusted, the one who would sit with him for hours, reading old scripts, playing clips from their films, trying to anchor him to who he had been. Sometimes it worked, and Rob would light up, recognizing a line or a joke, and those moments felt like miracles, but there were darker days too. Days when Rob would look at Tom with fear in his eyes and accuse him of being a stranger, an imposter. Tom would go home after those visits and cry in the shower, so his family wouldn't hear, wondering how much more either of them could take. His wife would hold him at night, whispering that he was doing everything he could, but guilt is a stubborn thing, and it had already taken root in his heart. He worried constantly that he was failing his friend, that no matter how much love he gave, it would never be enough to stop what was happening. One afternoon, Rob asked Tom to record their conversations. He said he wanted proof that his life had been real, that his thoughts and memories hadn't just been a dream. Tom did it reluctantly, not knowing if it was right, but wanting to honor Rob's wish. Those recordings became sacred to him, a private archive of laughter, fear, and heartbreaking honesty. Rob talked about his childhood, his dreams, his regrets, and the people he loved, including famous names like Carrie Fisher and Carl Reiner, his own father, who had taught him how to find humor even in pain. Listening back later, Tom said, was like hearing a. As he wiped his eyes, it became clear that there was still more he hadn't said, something even heavier, something that explained why he had waited until now, at 78, to finally speak. The room seemed to hold its breath with him, knowing that the deepest secret was still waiting in the shadows, ready to step into the light. Tom took a long, uneven breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a tremor that went beyond grief. He revealed that the reason he had stayed silent for so long was not just out of loyalty, but out of fear. Rob had made him promise something on that last clear day, something that had weighed on Tom like a stone in his chest ever since. Rob had asked him not to let the world turn his illness into a spectacle, not to let the headlines reduce his life to a tragic ending. He wanted to be remembered for his work, for the laughter he gave people, not for the slow, cruel way his mind betrayed him. Tom had agreed, even though it meant swallowing his own need to talk about the pain. For years, he watched as fans speculated, as gossip columns whispered, and as Hollywood moved on, all while he held onto the truth alone. At award shows, people would mention Rob with fondness, and Tom would smile, nod, and say nothing. Inside, he was screaming. He felt like he was living a double life, one where he was the cheerful public figure, and another where he was a grieving friend carrying a secret that no one else could see. His children noticed the change in him, the way he grew quieter, more withdrawn, and they worried about him in ways children shouldn't have to worry about their father. Then there was the day Tom nearly broke. He was at home, flipping through channels, when he stumbled upon one of their old films. There was Rob, vibrant and full of life, and for a moment it felt like he was still there. Tom sank to the floor, overwhelmed by a wave of memories, and played one of the recordings Rob had asked him to keep. Hearing his friend's voice again, so close and yet so impossibly far, shattered something inside him. He realized that keeping the secret had not protected Rob's memory. It had only isolated him in his grief. He began to talk to other friends from that era, quietly at first. People like Meg Ryan and Billy Crystal, who had loved Rob in their own ways, since there was more he wasn't saying. They shared their own regrets, their own moments of wishing they had been there more. And Tom saw how deeply Rob had touched all of them. The pain wasn't his alone, and maybe it never should have been. Still, the promise he had made echoed in his mind, holding him back every time he got close to telling the full story. What finally pushed him to speak was his own health. He admitted, almost apologetically, that age had brought its own fears, its own doctor visits and quiet worries. Lying in a hospital bed one night, listening to the beeping of machines, he thought of Rob, of how he had faced the end with such raw honesty. Tom realized he didn't want to leave this world with words still trapped inside him, with love and truth left unspoken. He wanted his children to know what real friendship looked like. Even when it was messy and painful, he looked in the camera. Tom said he was no longer afraid of breaking that old promise, because he believed Rob would understand. Telling the truth wasn't about exposing his friend. It was about honoring him, about showing the world the depth of his courage and the reality of what he went through. His voice softened as he spoke Rob's name, and for a moment it felt like they were together again, two friends sharing something private and sacred. The story was nearing its most fragile point now, and the emotion in the room was almost unbearable. Tom knew that what he was about to reveal next would change everything. Not just how people saw Rob, but how they understood the bond between them. And the air seemed to tremble with the weight of it. Tom looked into the lens as if he were staring into a memory that still hurt too much to touch. In this imagined version of his life, this strange, cinematic, what if that felt more real than reality itself, he finally said what his heart had been holding back. He spoke of a night that never existed on any calendar, but lived vividly in his soul, when Rob had called him and asked him to come over one last time. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes when a long story is nearing its end, and they sat together in a dim living room, two old friends surrounded by the echoes of their younger self. Yes, Rob in this imagined world was thinner, his eyes deeper, but his spirit still unmistakably his. He told Tom he was tired of pretending everything was fine, tired of smiling for cameras that could never see what was really happening inside him. He confessed that his mind felt like a hallway of doors slowly closing, each one taking a memory, a joke, a piece of himself with it. Tom reached for his hand, and in that unreal yet painfully vivid moment, he felt the weight of every year they had spent together. They talked about films, about mistakes, about people they had loved and lost, even about legends like Carrie Fisher and Carl Reiner, who had shaped their lives in ways they were still trying to understand. There was a moment when Rob's voice softened, and he said something that sounded like both a confession and a farewell. He told Tom that if he ever disappeared, whether in body or in spirit, he hoped Tom would tell their story the way it really felt, messy and painful and full of love. In this imagined reality, Tom promised him he would, even though he knew how much it would hurt. The air between them felt thick with unshed tears, and when Rob leaned back, closing his eyes, Tom was afraid to look away, afraid that if he did, something would be gone forever. Back in the studio now, decades later, Tom's voice shook as he described this what-if memory, this symbolic last meeting that represented everything he wished he could have said and done. He admitted that for years he had been carrying the weight of that promise in his heart, wondering if he had lived up to it. His family had watched him wrestle with ghosts of a friendship that still felt unfinished. And sometimes even his children would ask him why he seemed so sad when Rob's name came up. He never knew how to explain that some bonds don't end. Even when the story does it, he wiped his eyes and continued, saying that this imagined confession was his way of finally letting go, of honoring the love and pain they shared without being trapped by it. It wasn't about facts or timelines, but about the truth of what it felt like to love someone deeply and still lose them in ways you can't control. As the room filled with his quiet sobs, it felt as though Rob himself was listening, somewhere beyond the reach of time, understanding at last what Tom had been trying to say. The emotion lingered in the air, unresolved and aching, as Tom took another breath, knowing there was still more to share in this long, winding story of friendship, regret, and imagined last words that felt more real than anything else he had ever known. The room seemed to dim around Tom as he went on, as if even the lights understood the fragility of what he was about to reveal. In this cinematic what-if world he was opening for us, he described how the imagined Rob had once handed him a small, worn notebook, its pages filled with half-written thoughts, jokes, and memories that were slowly fading from his mind. Rob had said it was his way of fighting back, of leaving pieces of himself behind so he wouldn't disappear completely. Tom kept that notebook in a drawer for years, taking it out only when the ache eye. As he spoke Rob's name again, it felt less like a story and more like a prayer. The imagined Rob was no longer just a character in this what-if world, but a representation of every friend we fear losing, every relationship that changes in ways we can't control. Tom said that by telling this story, he wasn't trying to rewrite the past, but to give voice to the emotions that never got a chance to be heard. The air in the studio was thick with something that felt like both sorrow and release, and Tom knew he was moving closer to the heart of what he had been carrying all these years. There was still one final layer to peel back, one last truth in this imagined confession that would tie everything together and leave nothing hidden anymore. As Tom drew a slow breath, It felt like he was standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, and his eyes reflected a depth of emotion that words could barely reach. In this imagined universe he had been inviting us into, he finally spoke about the moment that changed everything, the moment when he realized that holding on to grief had become a way of holding on to Rob. He described a quiet morning years after their last symbolic meeting, when he opened the notebook one final time and found a page he had never noticed before. It was just a few lines, written shakily, about letting go, about trusting that love doesn't vanish just because memory does. Reading it felt like Rob was gently telling him it was okay to stop hurting. That was when Tom said he began to understand that this story, this what if confession, wasn't really about illness or loss, but about the way people imprint themselves on each other forever. Rob had been his creative partner, his friend, his brother in everything but blood, and even in this imagined sorrowful ending, that bond had never truly been broken. The pain was real because the love had been real, and pretending otherwise had only deepened the wound. Sharing this story now felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed for far too long. He talked about how this symbolic Rob still lived on in every film they had made, in every laugh they had shared, and even in the silences that followed. Other Hollywood figures had come and gone, but that connection remained a quiet thread through his life. Tom said that in telling this story, he hoped people would see not just the tragedy, but the beauty of a friendship that was so strong it could survive even an imagined ending. His voice steadied a little as he realized that this was not a betrayal of Rob, but a tribute. The studio felt warmer now, as if the weight that had been pressing down on him was finally lifting. Tom looked calmer, more at peace, and for the first time since he began speaking, there was a hint of a gentle smile through the tears. He had carried this imagined secret for so long, and letting it out felt like finally exhaling after years of holding his breath. As he finished this part of the story, there was a sense that something profound had been shared, something that went beyond celebrity or fiction and touched something deeply human. The journey wasn't quite over yet, but the hardest truths had been spoken, and whatever came next would be shaped by that fragile, honest release. Tom sat back in his chair, the weight of everything he had shared settling into the quiet around him like falling dust after a long storm. In this imagined world, where memory and emotion blurred into something more honest than fact, he finally felt as though he had said what his heart had been trying to say for years. He spoke softly now, almost to himself, about how love does not end when people fade, how it lingers in the spaces they once filled, in the stories we tell, and in the tears we still shed long after the laughter is gone. Rob, in this symbolic confession, was no longer just a friend who had slipped away, but a presence that would always live inside him, shaping who he was and who he would become. He imagined Rob somewhere beyond time, no longer afraid, no longer losing pieces of himself, finally whole again. That thought brought him a strange, gentle comfort. The regret he had carried began to loosen its grip, replaced by a quiet gratitude for having known a love so deep it could still hurt this much. Tom said that maybe that was the real legacy of any life, not the awards or the headlines, but the hearts we touch and the people who carry us forward even when we are gone. As the studio lights glowed softly, he closed his eyes for a moment, picturing two younger versions of himself and Rob sitting together, laughing over dreams that felt endless. He let that image linger, not as something lost, but as something forever part of him. When he opened his eyes again, there was a calm there that hadn't been before, a sense that the story, painful as it was, had finally found its place. And in that stillness, the imagined truth settled like a quiet promise, that even in a world of fading memories and broken hearts, love remains, whispering through time, waiting to be remembered.